Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with a small confession. Shamanism has been so badly misunderstood that most people still think it was all feathers, funny dances, and drug trips. From sucking invisible arrows of illness out of your chest and spitting them into a bowl, to collapsing in convulsions while still managing to recite the spirit's shopping list, to being blamed for every storm, cough, or goat that sneezed at the wrong time. Shamans were never the witch doctors you were promised in old movies. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy wandering with me through the stranger corners of human history. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to imagine all of us scattered across the world, sitting in the same circle together. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, let the room get quiet, and settle in. Tonight, we're stepping into the smoke and rhythm of a world where trances, spirits, and possession weren't superstition, they were survival. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one scrolling through glowing rectangles while eating reheated leftovers, but the one who woke up in a world where illness wasn't something you Googled at midnight, but something you negotiated with spirits. And here's the first thing you'd need to drop from your modern head. You would not be the local witch doctor. That phrase, bless its colonial dustiness, is like calling a neurosurgeon the village head-scratcher if you'd been born into Siberia's endless white silence or the dripping canopy of the Amazon. The shaman wasn't some eccentric with feathers glued to their head, throwing herbs into the fire. They were the negotiator, the cosmic bureaucrat, the one you begged to fix things when your child coughed blood, when the hunt failed, or when the spirits of the dead got a little too clingy. They weren't there to cast spells in the Harry Potter sense. They were there to manage the terrifying customer service line between humans and the unseen. See, most societies didn't make neat boxes for medicine, religion, politics, and therapy. They rolled it all into one overworked human being who had to deal with every crisis that couldn't be solved with spears or soup. You'd think that's a glamorous job-chosen intermediary of the spirits. But it was more like being the person everyone calls when their Wi-Fi is down. Except the Wi-Fi is the balance of the cosmos, and the punishment for failure isn't bad Yelp reviews, it's famine. The colonial image of witch doctor has always made it sound like shamans were bumbling sorcerers, muttering gibberish in caves. The reality, they were walking encyclopedias of botany, anatomy, ritual codes, and mythology, wrapped in one anxious package. A Siberian shaman, for example, could name dozens of plants that cured fevers or stopped bleeding. An Amazonian shaman knew which hallucinogenic vine mixed with which leaf unlocked visions, and which combination would just make you vomit until you politely died. And don't confuse them with priests either. Priests in many societies spoke to the gods on behalf of everyone. They recited official prayers, kept temples tidy, managed donations. Shamans weren't managers of religion, they were crisis workers. When a child's soul was stolen by a wandering ghost, the priest was useless. You called the shaman. When the crops rotted and the hunters came back empty, you needed someone who could climb into trance, wrestle the spirits, and come back with answers. If you were that person, you wouldn't get to retire to a tidy suburban life. Every sickness, every accident, every misfortune in your village might land at your feet. Someone's goat tripped. Could be evil spirits. Someone's baby died. Definitely evil spirits. Your entire existence was to mediate a conversation that never ended. It wasn't superstition, it was structure. It was how people explained, endured, and sometimes survived a world that seemed full of teeth. So no, you wouldn't be the witch doctor. You'd be the one dragged out of bed at midnight, rattling bones, chanting until your throat cracked, and explaining to a very nervous family that yes, the spirits were angry again, and no, you couldn't just give them aspirin. You'd be living proof that anthropology got it right and colonial vocabulary got it laughably wrong. And if you're still imagining yourself with a cartoon bone through your nose, let's fix that, because the next mistake people make is assuming every society even had shamans in the first place. So now that you've shed the title of witch doctor, let's deal with the next myth, that shamanism was everywhere. One size fits all, like the ancient equivalent of Wi-Fi. It wasn't. If you'd been born into the Kalahari, the Amazon, or Siberia, you might have met a shaman. But if you were unlucky enough to pop up in ancient Greece or early Mesopotamia, good luck finding one. There were priests, prophets, and oracles aplenty, but not shamans in the classic sense. Shamanism wasn't a global subscription package. It was a patchwork appearing in some places, absent in others, and changing form depending on where you were born. Imagine walking across the steppe in Siberia. There, a shaman beat a drum carved from reindeer hide, climbed into trance, and rode the sound into a world of spirits. Cross the ocean to the Amazon, and suddenly, it's not drumming, but ayahuasca, a brew of vine and leaf that makes you see serpents curling through the sky. Keep moving to Korea, and you'll find madang, mostly women, conducting elaborate ceremonies with colorful robes and offerings of food to restless ancestors. See, the problem is saying shamanism like it's one thing. It's like pointing at sushi, tacos, and croissants and saying, "Ah yes, bread." Technically true, wildly misleading. If you'd been born in one of these cultures, your training, your tools, even your very job description would have looked radically different. In some places, you'd spend years mastering drum rhythms that carried you to the upper or lower worlds. In others, you'd learn exactly how to brew psychoactive plants that opened the skull and flooded visions into your body. And in a few, you might use nothing but your own voice, chanting until the sound itself cracked open the boundaries of ordinary perception. Same title, entirely different manuals. And then there were places that simply didn't bother with shamans at all. Ancient Egypt, for instance, had priests who handled divine business, not shamans galloping on imaginary reindeer to battle demons. In early Christianity, the job of mediating the sacred was monopolized by the church, and anyone trancing with spirits was more likely to be burned than applauded. But that's exactly the mistake outsiders make, treating shamanism like it's one giant religion. It isn't. It never was. It's a method, a set of techniques, adapted to wildly different environments. Shamans in Siberia needed to deal with long winters, endless herds, and the terrifying vastness of the tundra. Shamans in the Amazon worked in the thick green cathedral of the rainforest, where every plant seemed to have an opinion about your liver. Even the spirits they dealt with weren't interchangeable. A Korean madang didn't summon the same beings as an Inuit, and spirits had local dialects. So if you were living back then, don't imagine yourself signing up for Shamanism 101 and getting the same package as everyone else. Depending on your birthplace, you might be handed a drum, a vine brew, a dagger, or nothing at all. And that's where the confusion creeps in, because if shamanism wasn't universal, and it wasn't uniform, then who got to decide who became one in the first place? And here's another bubble I have to pop for you. You didn't just wake up one day, throw on a feathered hat, and say, "I think I'll be a shaman." No, that's Instagram logic, not anthropology. In most places, you didn't choose shamanism. It chose you, and it didn't ask politely. If you'd been born into a culture where shamans existed, the spirits would have tapped you on the shoulder, early and by tapped, I mean dragged you through the kind of illness that made everyone whisper you weren't going to survive. What outsiders often miss is that shamanic initiation wasn't a weekend retreat with chanting and scented candles. It was years of torment, fevers, seizures, visions, hearing voices, dreaming of being torn apart by animals. Lovely stuff. The community watched closely. If you survived and came back with stories that matched what older shamans already knew, visions of cosmic ladders, animal guides, ancestors, you weren't declared insane. You were declared chosen. And this is where the acid irony bites. If you had these symptoms today, someone would probably prescribe you medication and tell you to stay hydrated. Back then, it meant the spirits wanted your resume. The training wasn't a solo journey either. You'd usually be apprenticed to a senior shaman. Imagine years of memorizing chants, learning which plants healed and which ones killed, studying how to enter trance without, well, accidentally not coming back. Every step of your education was a mix of danger and drudgery. You had to prove you could navigate the invisible without losing your mind or your body, and you didn't get to walk away. Some traditions even believed that if you refused the call, you'd die, or worse, your entire family would get sick. The spirits weren't offering a career opportunity. They were blackmailing you into service. Declining the role was like telling the gods you'd prefer to keep binge-watching reality shows instead of fixing the universe. Spoiler, they weren't impressed. So if you imagine yourself in that world, don't picture strutting into town announcing, "I'm the new shaman." The community had to accept you. Without their recognition, you were just a lunatic with a drum. Your legitimacy came not from your costume, but from people believing you could actually do what you claimed: cure sickness, find lost souls, make rain, protect the hunters. If you failed, you weren't just unemployed, you were dangerous. It's a cruel paradox. The very symptoms that might get you medicated or institutionalized today, hallucinations, convulsions, speaking in strange voices, were, in certain cultures, the golden ticket to spiritual authority. Except it wasn't a golden ticket. It was a lifetime sentence. From that moment on, you weren't your own person. You were a channel, a tool, a fragile bridge between humans and the spirits they feared. And if you think that sounds exhausting, wait until you realize the trance states that made you valuable weren't always chemical. No, ayahuasca buffet, by default. Some shamans had to get there the hard way. Now here's where modern imagination really derails. You probably picture every shaman with a pipe, a pouch of suspicious leaves, and a guaranteed one-way ticket to psychedelic Disneyland. But let me tell you, if you'd been born into the wrong shamanic tradition, the only thing you'd be inhaling was sweat and exhaustion. The truth is simple. Not every shaman reached trance through plants. Some did, yes. The Amazon is legendary for its ayahuasca brews, a potent cocktail of vine and leaf that, by biochemical coincidence, slams open the brain's locked doors. But in Siberia, no jungle vines, just endless snow. There, shamans relied on the drum, pounding rhythms like a heartbeat until the sound itself pulled them out of their bodies. Hours of repetition, a single note echoing into the night, until the entire village swore the shaman's spirit had left the tent and wandered off into the sky. And if you had been born Inuit, you wouldn't have swallowed a drop of psychedelic soup. Instead, you'd have sung yourself into long, trembling chants, sometimes in the dark, sometimes while staring into the ice. No colors exploding behind your eyelids, no jaguar visions, just the haunting hum of your own voice until you slipped sideways into the other world. In fact, many shamans were specialists in non-chemical techniques: fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, or the opposite, sensory deprivation. Some sat alone in caves for days, others danced until their bodies gave up and their minds slid elsewhere. It wasn't about drugs, it was about manipulating the fragile architecture of consciousness. If you'd been raised in those societies, your body itself was the laboratory. Breath, hunger, rhythm, silence, they were the tools. And here's the thing, it worked. Studies today have shown that repetitive drumming at 4 to 7 beats per second can actually shift brainwaves into theta states, the same ones people hit in deep meditation or lucid dreaming. In other words, you don't need ayahuasca to leave your body. You just need a really stubborn wrist and a community willing to listen to the racket for 6 hours straight. Of course, in places where plants were available, they were used, and with terrifying precision. Amazonian shamans didn't just brew ayahuasca at random. They combined the Banisteriopsis vine with Psychotria viridis leaves, because one contains DMT and the other contains MAO inhibitors, making the visions actually possible. That's not folk superstition. That's high-level chemistry long before laboratories. But here's the catch. Whether it was plants, drums, or voices, trance wasn't a private recreational trip. You weren't allowed to wander around seeing cosmic snakes for fun. You had a job. The community was watching. People expected you to negotiate with spirits, find out why the hunt was failing, or bring back the soul of a sick child. Your trance wasn't judged by how many colors you set, it was judged by results. So if you were that shaman, don't imagine yourself leaning back in a hammock whispering, "Wow, the spirits are beautiful tonight." More likely, you'd be drenched in sweat, gripping your drum, or doubled over from a brew, with the whole village waiting for you to cough out the reason the crops had died. And if you thought slipping into trance was dramatic, wait until you hear about possession, because contrary to what horror movies taught you, being possessed didn't mean you were helpless. It meant you were very much in charge. Let's be honest. If I say the word possession, you probably picture pea soup, head spinning, and a priest with a crucifix yelling at demons to get out of a 12-year-old girl. Hollywood sold you chaos. But if you'd been born into a culture where shamanic possession mattered, you'd know it wasn't chaos at all. It was choreography. When a shaman became a spirit, they weren't losing themselves in a screaming fit. They were slipping into a role. Think of it less like a horror movie and more like improv theater. Except the audience wasn't clapping politely. They were terrified that if you botched the lines, the harvest would fail. You, the shaman, had to speak with the voice of the spirit. But you also had to keep enough awareness to avoid blurting something socially awkward like, "The gods say your goat is ugly." And make no mistake, people could tell the difference between a convincing possession and a lazy one. In Siberia, when a shaman collapsed, trembled, and started speaking in strange voices, everyone expected consistency. If the spirit said it loved milk one week and hated it the next, suspicion grew. In Korea, Madang, female shamans let ancestral spirits borrow their bodies, delivering messages in a precise, recognizable voice. It wasn't random madness, it was accountability. So if you had been in that position, imagine the pressure, your body shaking, your eyes rolling, your throat producing words you never rehearsed down yet. Deep inside, you were steering it. You were managing the timing, the rhythm, the crowd. You were possessed, but you were also a conductor, making sure the orchestra didn't fall apart. Dual awareness. The spirit and you, together, in one exhausting duet. And here's the kicker. Possession wasn't always terrifying. Sometimes it was healing. In Amazonian ayahuasca ceremonies, shamans described spirits entering their bodies, not to torture them, but to lend knowledge, songs, techniques, cures. In parts of Africa, possession during trance dancing could be joyous, a way for gods to dance with people rather than against them. You weren't being hijacked. You were hosting a very powerful guest. That doesn't mean it was safe. There were cultures that believed if you couldn't manage possession, if the spirits pushed you too far, you could go insane or die. Some initiations deliberately pushed novices to that edge to see if they could come back. Possession was like balancing on a knife's edge. You had to let go enough to convince the community the spirit was real, but not so much that you didn't return. Now imagine yourself in that role. You're in a dark tent, lit only by firelight. Drums hammer like a heartbeat. You tremble, gasp, collapse. The spirit arrives. Your voice shifts. Your body jerks, but in the middle of all that, a tiny part of you is still calculating. Is the crowd convinced? Did I say the right ritual words? Is this ancestor sounding cranky enough? If you mess up, the ceremony collapses. If you do it right, the crowd leaves awed, convinced the spirit world just brushed against their skin. So no, possession didn't mean you were out of control. It meant you were in terrifying control. You had to master the performance of losing yourself, which, if you think about it, is the hardest trick of all. And if you're wondering who exactly got to do this, who was allowed to collapse, convulse, and come back crowned in legitimacy, don't assume it was always men holding the drum. If you imagine yourself as the village shaman, you're probably picturing yourself as an old man with a beard, animal skins, and a stick that doubles as both staff and walking aid. Congratulations, you've accidentally swallowed the most stubborn myth of all, that shamanism was a boys-only club. It wasn't. In fact, in many cultures, women were not just allowed to be shamans, they were the backbone of the practice. Step into Korea, for instance, and you'd find the Madang female shamans, who still today conduct elaborate ceremonies, calling ancestors to speak, dance, and heal through their bodies. Most Madang weren't noblewomen either. They were often poor, widowed, or marginalized people the mainstream society dismissed. And yet, when spirits came knocking, suddenly those same women held enormous spiritual authority, able to bring generals and merchants crawling for advice. Now cross over to Siberia, and the story complicates even more. Among the Owenki or Yakut, women could and did become shamans, sometimes with reputations equal to or greater than the men. They could drum, chant, and journey just as far into the spirit world. Some were chosen by illness, others by visions, same as their male counterparts. And because childbirth itself was considered a brush with death, women were often thought to have a natural affinity with the other side. And if you were imagining gender as fixed, think again. Some shamanic traditions blurred those lines deliberately. In certain Siberian groups, male shamans wore women's clothing, adopted female roles, and claimed it made them more powerful intermediaries. Among the Chukchi, a male shaman could marry another man if the spirits demanded it, living as a woman in society. Not as a scandal, not as a rebellion, but as a sacred calling. The spirits, after all, weren't picky about human categories. If you'd been born in one of these societies, your sex at birth didn't guarantee your spiritual role. The spirits might decide otherwise. They might call you to shift, to cross, to live at the edge of categories. In fact, that liminal position between man and woman, life and death, sanity and madness, was often considered the perfect place for a shaman to exist. Who better to cross worlds than someone who embodied crossing themselves? Of course, This flexibility didn't stop colonial observers from rewriting the story. European missionaries hated female shamans. They dismissed them as hysterical, deceitful, or possessed by devils. The men they could grudgingly compare to priests. The women they tried to erase altogether. Which is why today the stubborn image of the male shaman lingers, while the reality was far more complicated, far more fluid. So if you picture yourself in that world, don't automatically give yourself a beard and a falcon-headed staff. You might be a widow in Korea, dancing and weeping as ancestors speak through you. You might be a young Siberian woman, chosen after fever dreams, drumming in a reindeer hide tent. You might be a man dressed in women's clothing, because the spirits whispered you'd be stronger that way. You'd be a boundary crosser, a shapeshifter, someone the community relied on precisely because you weren't easy to categorize. And if you're still clutching the old stereotype, let me remind you, shamanism wasn't primitive psychology either. It wasn't about soothing troubled minds, it was about wrestling with the cosmos itself. If you'd been born into a world where shamans mattered, you wouldn't be lying on a couch talking about your mother while someone scribbled notes. You'd be lying on the ground, shaking, while a shaman sucked an invisible arrow of illness out of your ribs and spat it into a bowl. Not quite Freud. And yet, modern writers love to say shamans were just early psychologists, therapists with better costumes. That's like calling open-heart surgery a more hands-on hug. Sure, shamans dealt with the mind. They worked with dreams, fears, grief, the invisible weight of trauma. But their job wasn't limited to mental health. It was everything health. If your leg was broken, if your stomach was full of parasites, if your baby wouldn't stop crying, the shaman was there. They combined ritual with medicine, myth with botany. Among the Shipibo in the Amazon, shamans knew hundreds of plants, some to heal, some to poison, some to open visions. In Siberia, a shaman might diagnose you by listening to your pulse, then send their soul out hunting for the piece of yours that had wandered away. Because that's what illness often meant in those societies. Not bacteria, not random misfortune, but a soul gone missing or a hostile spirit invading. So if you had been sick, the shaman didn't hand you pills. They went into trance, followed the trail of your soul, bargained with the beings who'd stolen it, and dragged it back. If that sounds theatrical, it was, but to the people who witnessed it, it was also practical. Healing was performance convincing, not just you, but your family, your community. That balance had been restored. And don't assume it was all gentle talk and soft voices. Shamanic healing could be terrifying. In some Amazonian ceremonies, the healer leaned close and sucked violently at the patient's skin, then spat out a bloody thorn, a stone, or even a beetle, claiming it was the spiritual intrusion causing the sickness. Was it sleight of hand? Sometimes. Was it effective? Often. Because what mattered wasn't whether a beetle had been living in your chest. It was whether you and your family believed the sickness had left. And belief, as modern placebo studies keep proving, can be half the cure. But to stop at psychology is to miss the bigger picture. Shamans weren't just there to heal individuals. They healed environments. If the rains didn't come, if the game animals disappeared, if the village was haunted by bad luck, it was the shaman's responsibility to negotiate with the unseen powers. Imagine your therapist being called to end a drought, chase off demons, and also make sure your cousin doesn't get eaten by spirits on the way home. If you were that shaman, your daily work blurred every line modern categories rely on. Doctor, priest, therapist, ecologist, performer. You had to be all of them at once. A healer of bodies, yes, but also of worlds, of crops, of communities. The primitive psychologist's label isn't just wrong, it's lazy. It shrinks an enormous, terrifying responsibility into a job description that fits neatly on a modern resume. So don't flatter yourself thinking you'd just be dispensing ancient talk therapy. If you'd been chosen, your job was to restore order between humans, animals, ancestors, and gods. And while you were doing that, everyone else was watching carefully, because the truth is, you rarely worked alone. If you imagine yourself as a shaman, maybe you're picturing a lone figure silhouetted against the firelight, chanting into the void like some mystical freelancer. That's cute, but the reality, you probably would have had an entourage. Because shamanism wasn't always a solo gig, was more often a group project, where failure meant crop failure, famine, or everyone suspecting you'd lost your edge. Think about Siberian shamans. They might be the center of the ritual, but their drumming often came from others, two apprentices or helpers, who kept the rhythm going while the main shaman slipped into trance. In the Amazon, ayahuasca ceremonies weren't one-on-one therapy sessions. They were communal marathons. Entire villages gathered, candles burning, chants spiraling in the dark, while multiple shamans sang Icaros medicine songs to guide the visions. One person alone couldn't manage all that chaos. And if you'd been in Korea, you'd have seen something even more theatrical. A gut ritual wasn't just a shaman whispering to the spirits. It was a full production. Musicians, assistants, offerings piled high, and often multiple shamans working together to channel ancestors. The mudang was the star, yes, but stars don't shine without stagehands. Even apprentices had roles. You wouldn't have started at the top. You'd begin by fetching materials, learning songs, observing rituals, maybe keeping the fire going. Slowly you'd graduate to helping with drumming, chanting, and minor things. Years later, if the spirits didn't kill you first, you'd step into the spotlight. Until then, you were part of a team whether you liked it or not. And let's not forget the community itself. In many cases, the ritual only worked because everyone participated. They danced, they sang, they lent their energy to the trance. In fact, some anthropologists argue that what outsiders called shamanism was often less about the shaman's private visions and more about the communal theater of belief. If you'd been sitting in the crowd, you weren't just watching. You were inside the ritual, swept up in the drumming, the smoke, the strange movements. Without you, the performance had no audience. Without an audience, there was no power. So much for the lone wolf stereotype. The truth is, if you were that shaman, you had to manage relationships, not just spirits. You had assistants watching you, apprentices learning from you, rivals trying to outshine you, and a community evaluating your every move. One slip, one sign that the spirits didn't show up, and suddenly someone else was being trained as your replacement. And this is the part modern imaginations never quite grasp, the collective dimension. Shamanism wasn't about personal visions to brag about later. It was about responsibility shared across a group, woven through music, dance, and community presence. The shaman might have been the conductor, but the orchestra was massive. So no, you wouldn't have been a solitary genius tripping under the stars. You'd have been a very stressed project manager, making sure your assistants didn't mess up the drumbeat, your apprentices didn't faint in the smoke, and your neighbors didn't decide you were slacking. And the moment you thought about quitting, well, the spirits had other ideas. Because becoming a shaman wasn't exactly voluntary. If you'd been born into a world where shamans existed, you wouldn't get to flip through a cosmic career catalog and pick spiritual mediator because it sounded cool. You'd be drafted, and not by your village council, but by the spirits themselves, who apparently had a flair for cruelty. The call usually came wrapped in suffering. In Siberia, it was often a mysterious illness, fevers, convulsions, voices in the night. Among the Inuit, you might be plagued by terrifying dreams until you either broke down completely or agreed to train. In the Amazon, a string of near-death experiences, snake bites, lightning strikes, terrifying visions, could mark you as chosen. In every case, the message was clear: accept or perish. So imagine yourself there. You're 15, shaking with fever, seeing animals claw at your body in visions. Your family gathers around, whispering that the spirits want you. If you say no, you might die. If you say yes, you might live, but only by dedicating the rest of your existence to being the community's 24/7 cosmic crisis hotline. Some choice, and the spirits didn't just haunt you in dreams. They could harass your relatives too, making your refusal everyone's problem. A stubborn illness spreading through your family. Obviously your fault, the crops failing. Must be because you haven't taken up the drum. Congratulations, you're spiritually blackmailed into service. Once you gave in, the training began. Apprenticeship wasn't summer camp. It was years of memorizing chants, learning rituals, and surviving ordeals designed to break you down and rebuild you as someone who could navigate the spirit world without collapsing. Sometimes this included ritual isolation, fasting, or hallucinogens taken in terrifying doses. You weren't finding yourself. You were being remade. And don't think you could fake it. Communities watched carefully. If your illness ended and you came back without new knowledge, without visions that matched what other shamans knew, you weren't accepted. At best, you were ignored. At worst, you were accused of being cursed, or worse, dangerous. Legitimacy didn't come from self-declaration. It came from your suffering, your survival, and your recognition by both the spirits and the people. Even later, once you were established, you didn't get to quit. A shaman who tried to walk away risked sickness returning, or disasters blamed on their negligence. In some traditions, refusing to continue meant death. You were bound for life. So if you're still imagining shamanism as a kind of personal spiritual hobby, erase it. It wasn't a free choice. It was obligation disguised as destiny, terror disguised as training. You weren't living your truth. You were living the spirit's truth, whether you wanted to or not. And once you were in, every tool you touched, from drums to rattles to elaborate costumes, wasn't for flair. They weren't accessories. They were weapons, shields, and maps for navigating the invisible. If you'd been a shaman, your wardrobe wasn't just a matter of what looks good in the firelight. Every feather, every strip of iron, every rattle tied to your belt was functional. Outsiders looked at shamans and saw fancy costumes. Anthropologists with a bit more patience realized those costumes were more like military gear for invisible battle. Take the Siberian drum. To an outsider, it's a piece of hide stretched across a frame. To the shaman, it's a literal map of the universe. The rim represented the boundary between worlds. The surface painted with suns, moons, and spirits acted as a passport. When you pounded it, you weren't just making noise. You were climbing onto your drum like it was a reindeer or a bird, riding its sound across the cosmic landscape. Imagine being told your therapist can also teleport using percussion. Costumes worked the same way. A Yakut shaman's coat might weigh 30 pounds because it was covered in iron plaques, chains, and dangling charms. Why? Because those iron plates weren't decoration. They were armor, each one forged to protect the shaman's body during spiritual combat. Some coats had sewn-in images of wings, so when the shaman entered trance, they weren't just a human, they were a bird flying between worlds. You'd feel ridiculous walking around in it, but everyone else would see you transformed into something far more than human. Masks, rattles, staffs, all of them were more than props. Rattles imitated the sound of spirits moving. Staffs were ladders, representing the cosmic tree you climbed to reach the sky or descended to reach the underworld. In Korea, shamans used bright robes and colorful streamers, not because spirits had a fashion sense, but because those colors were invitations, signals to ancestors saying, "Yes, the door is open, come through me." And let's not forget the sounds. A costume wasn't silent. Every chain clinked, every bead rattled, every feather swished. When you entered trance, the noise around your body was part of the performance. The sound itself confused spirits, distracted hostile forces, and kept everyone in the village aware that something was happening even if the tent was dark. If you had been wearing one of these costumes, it would have felt like dragging around a full toolbox strapped to your skin. Hot, heavy, uncomfortable. But there was no skipping it. Without the gear, you weren't protected. Without the drum, you weren't traveling. Without the rattle, your words didn't carry to the other side. These weren't accessories, they were lifelines. And the community knew it. The moment you put on that coat, they weren't looking at you anymore. They were looking at the shaman, the armored bridge between the fragile humans in the circle and the unpredictable spirits pressing at the edges. That transformation wasn't metaphor, it was the entire point. So, if you're still picturing costumes as theatrical fluff, imagine trying to walk into a gunfight wearing pajamas. The gear mattered because the stakes were cosmic, and the higher those stakes got, the more political your role became, because shamans weren't just healers, they were also power brokers. If you're still imagining yourself as the shaman, let's clear something up. You weren't Switzerland. You weren't a neutral, apolitical figure floating serenely above tribal squabbles. You were neck-deep in politics, whether you wanted to be or not. Think about it. You were the one who could speak to the spirits. That meant, if the chief wanted to launch a raid, he needed you to confirm that the gods approved. If a rival wanted to challenge the chief, he needed you to say the omens were against him. Your voice wasn't just spiritual, it was ammunition. And ammunition gets used. In Siberia, shamans sometimes acted as advisors in disputes between clans. Your trance could tip the balance of who got hunting grounds or who was cursed with famine. In the Amazon, shamans were central in negotiations over territory, alliances, and revenge killings. Their visions, their diagnoses of misfortune, often dictated who was blamed and what punishment was carried out. Your neutral healing role could spark or prevent bloodshed. And if you think the community left you alone to make impartial judgments, think again. Leaders leaned on you. Families pressured you. Rivals accused you of favoritism. If someone in your village died unexpectedly, you might be asked to identify which sorcerer, which family was behind it. One wrong name, and you had enemies for life. Neutrality wasn't just impossible, it was suicidal. Even colonizers noticed. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Siberian shamans resisted Russian missionaries not only with rituals but with political clout. They rallied communities, refused to abandon traditions, and became symbols of resistance. In Korea, madang were often despised by elites but indispensable to commoners, giving them quiet political leverage against the state's Confucian rigidity. In the Americas, shamans sometimes worked with colonizers, other times against them, depending on who offered more power or protection. Neutral? Hardly. And let's not forget the rivalries. In many societies, there wasn't just one shaman. There were several, each with their own followers, their own apprentices, their own alliances. That meant shamanic politics within politics. Rival shamans accused each other of sorcery, stealing souls, or botching rituals on purpose. Entire villages could split along those lines. Imagine being a healer and a politician and a public relations officer, all while trying not to collapse in a trance. So if you had been that shaman, every ceremony you performed was political theater. When you cured a chief's illness, you weren't just restoring health, you were strengthening his power. When you declared a bad omen, you weren't just warning people, you were shaping decisions that could ripple across generations. Your chants were policy, your visions were verdicts, your neutrality, non-existent. And here's the most ironic twist. For all this influence, shamanism wasn't even a religion in itself. It was a method, a role, a set of tools plugged into different systems of belief. Which means the same figure who swayed politics in Siberia might look completely different in Tibet or the Amazon. Here's the thing you have to stop doing. Treating shamanism like it was some neat little religion you could box up and put on the shelf between Buddhism and Christianity. It wasn't. If you had been a shaman, you wouldn't have had a holy book, a temple hierarchy, or a calendar of feast days to keep track of. You would have had a drum, some rattles, and a very long list of spirits who wouldn't stop bothering you. Shamanism was never a religion in itself. It was a practice, a method, a toolkit. It was the how, not the what. Religions have doctrines, creeds, commandments. Shamans had techniques. You fasted, you drummed, you sang, you collapsed into trance. What you saw on the other side depended entirely on where you lived and what cosmology surrounded you. Take Siberia. Shamans there spoke of cosmic trees and underworld journeys. Move to the Amazon, and suddenly the spirit world is full of snakes, jaguars, and plant beings, teaching you songs. In Korea, Mudang dealt mostly with ancestor spirits of the dead, who hadn't moved on properly and wanted offerings of food and drink. Same method. Enter trance, negotiate with spirits, but utterly different content. That's why scholars hesitate to call it a religion. It's not a single belief system. It's an interface. Shamans were the plug adapters between humans and whatever metaphysical system their culture already believed in. In some places, shamanic practices were layered on top of animism, the belief that everything has a spirit. In others, they coexisted with Buddhism, like in Tibet, where shamans performed rituals alongside monks. In Christianized regions, some shamans even absorbed church imagery, calling on saints the way their ancestors once called on animal spirits. So if you'd been a shaman, you wouldn't have belonged to the church of shamanism. You'd have been working inside whatever belief matrix your society already had. And that's exactly what makes shamanism so slippery. It refuses to be confined. It's not a religion. It's a set of techniques that survived inside dozens of religions, quietly bending them, reshaping them, or hiding beneath them when colonizers tried to stamp them out. That adaptability is why shamanism never really disappeared. You can still see its fingerprints today. In Korea, gut rituals are still performed. In the Amazon, ayahuasqueros still drink the vine. In Siberia, neo-shamans revived drum ceremonies after decades of suppression. Even in the West, stripped-down versions of shamanic journeying workshops pop up in wellness centers. You can argue about authenticity all you want, but the fact remains, it's still here because it was never locked into one creed. So when someone says, shamanism is the world's oldest religion, they've already missed the point. It wasn't a religion, it was the technique religions kept borrowing. which also means it wasn't automatically peaceful, gentle, or benign. Because if you were that shaman, you weren't just a healer. You could be feared, envied, or accused of doing real damage. If you still imagine yourself as a shaman, swaying peacefully under the stars, whispering gentle wisdom about unity with nature, let me stop you. That's the postcard version, the New Age remix. In reality, shamans could be terrifying. Yes, they healed, but they also cursed. They soothed, but they also sowed fear. And sometimes, they weren't the village's favorite person. They were the one everyone suspected when things went wrong. If you'd lived in the Amazon, you'd know shamans weren't just healers, they were warriors in invisible wars. Rival shamans fought battles of sorcery, sending illnesses, nightmares, or deadly spirits at each other, like spiritual snipers. A sickness in the village, it wasn't always chalked up to bad luck. It could be an enemy shaman's attack, and then it was your job to fight back. Healing ceremonies often doubled as kappa strikes. When the healer sucked out that thorn or beetle supposedly lodged in your chest, it wasn't just theatrics, it was a way of showing, look, I found what the enemy sent into you. In Siberia, the stakes were just as high. Shamans could be accused of misusing their powers, of causing bad hunts or deaths. The same drum that carried your spirit into the sky could, in the wrong hands, become a weapon. Communities knew this, which is why shamans were treated with respect, laced with caution. You didn't cross them lightly. They could cure your fever, or they could quietly ensure it never left. And if you think this is some pre-modern exaggeration, even modern ethnographies describe the fear people still feel around shamans. Anthropologist Michael Tausig wrote of Amazonian healers whose reputation was double-edged, revered for their songs, dreaded for their capacity to curse. Healing and harming weren't two different jobs. They were two sides of the same role. So if you had been the shaman, don't imagine the community gazing at you with nothing but gratitude. They might also glare with suspicion. Every time you failed to cure someone, whispers could start. Maybe you chose not to heal. Maybe you were secretly allied with dark spirits. Maybe you caused the sickness in the first place. That's the cruel paradox. Your power made you indispensable, but it also made you dangerous in everyone's eyes. And it wasn't all about illness. Shamans could influence fertility, weather, and even war. If crops failed, people wondered if you'd offended the spirits or if you'd done it deliberately. If a storm sank canoes, they questioned whether you'd been paid off by a rival clan. You weren't the village sage with a twinkle in your eye. You were the walking risk factor, the volatile link between fragile humans and unpredictable spirits. So if you think shamanism was all peace pipes and good vibes, imagine instead being the one blamed for every shadow, every sickness, every untimely death. Healing didn't erase suspicion. In fact, sometimes it created more. Because if you could cure, surely you could also kill. And that fear never went away. And yet, despite all this suspicion and danger, shamanism never fully died out. Colonizers tried to stamp it out. Missionaries called it demonic. States outlawed it. And still, the drums kept beating. The ceremonies kept happening. Because fear or no fear, people still needed someone to face the spirits. If you'd been a shaman when the missionaries arrived, your job description would have taken a brutal hit. Suddenly, the spirits you'd been negotiating with for decades were rebranded as demons. Your drum was no longer a cosmic reindeer, it was the devil's instrument. And your entire life's work was condemned as heresy by people in hats large enough to double as shade structures. Colonial powers tried hard to snuff shamanism out. In Siberia, Russian Orthodox missionaries dragged shamans into courts, banned their rituals, and burned their drums. In Korea, the Confucian elite and later Christian missionaries called mudang superstitious parasites and tried to ban gut ceremonies. In the Americas, shamans were persecuted, their plants outlawed, their chants ridiculed. Across continents, being a shaman became a crime. And yet here's the inconvenient truth. It didn't disappear. It adapted. It went underground. If you'd been that shaman, you might have hidden your drum under your bed, conducting ceremonies in secret. In some places, you would have blended your practices with the colonizers' religion. Suddenly, the spirits wore Christian names. You might call on saints during trance instead of animal guides, because saints, at least, wouldn't get you flogged. Look at the Andes. When Spanish missionaries condemned local rituals, people simply wove Christian saints into the old cosmology. A mountain spirit could be disguised as St. James, an offering to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, was tucked under the veneer of Marian devotion. The same happened in Africa and the Americas. Yoruba deities fused with Catholic saints to survive in Candomblé and Santeria. It wasn't surrender, it was camouflage. In Korea, Mudong persisted despite centuries of suppression. Even during the Japanese occupation and later authoritarian governments, people kept sneaking to shamans for help. Publicly, you might attend church. Privately, you hired a mudang when your child was sick or your business faltered. Official bans never erased the demand. And in Siberia, despite brutal Soviet repression where shamans were branded as enemies of progress and sent to labor camps, practices endured in fragments. Some knowledge was hidden, passed down quietly in families. After the fall of the USSR, drums came out of hiding. Today, neo-shamanism thrives in places like Tuva and Yakusha, mixing ancient rituals with modern revival. Even in the Amazon, where missionaries worked hard to stop plant ceremonies, shamans held on to Now, ironically, it's being exported to the West as plant medicine, packaged for wellness retreats. The same practices once called demonic are now sold with spa menus and yoga mats. History has a twisted sense of humor. So if you'd been a shaman during colonial times, survival would have meant adaptation. You'd speak one way in public, another in private. You'd swap names, reframe rituals, bend practices until they looked Christian enough to pass inspection. But the core, the trance, the negotiation with spirits, because no matter how many laws were passed, no matter how many drums were burned, communities still needed someone to stand between them and the terrifying unknown. Which is why shamanism is still alive today. Not as a relic of the past, not as some fossilized tradition, but as something constantly changing. Which brings us to the final myth, that shamans were timeless, frozen figures of ancient wisdom. The truth. They weren't, still are modern, adaptable, and disturbingly good at keeping up. If you're still picturing shamans as frozen in time, noble relics, chanting forever in smoke-filled hutsuv, fallen for the museum display version, you know the one. Dim lighting, mannequins in feathered headdresses, a plaque calling it ancient tradition. But if you had actually been a shaman, you wouldn't have been a relic. You would have been painfully current. Shamanism was never static. It was always updating, remixing, adapting. When reindeer herds shifted in Siberia, shamans shifted their rituals. When colonizers brought guns, shamans sometimes included them in their visions, because if spirits were messengers of power, firearms were suddenly part of the cosmic conversation. In the Amazon, shamans today still brew ayahuasca, but now they do it with tourists in mind, offering ceremonies to people who flew in from airports rather than paddled in from villages. Tradition, yes, but packaged for globalization with mosquito nets and bottled water. Even in Korea, gut ceremonies haven't vanished. Mudangs still perform them in cities, complete with microphones and neon lights. Ancestors still speak, but now they do it in apartment courtyards and on live streams. Try calling that a relic. And here's the real twist. Shamans themselves often embraced new tools. In the 20th century, Siberian shamans used tape recorders to preserve chants. Some now upload their rituals to YouTube. The spirits apparently don't mind Wi-Fi. The idea that shamanism is pure and ancient is mostly a Western fantasy, a way to romanticize other people's traditions while pretending they exist outside of time. If you had been a shaman, your role would have demanded constant change. Spirits don't stay quiet, and neither do communities. New diseases, new crises, new technologies, all of it forced shamans to adapt. The tools might shift from bone rattles to microphones, but the core remained: entering trance, negotiating with forces beyond human control, and making meaning out of chaos. And yet, the myth of the timeless relic lingers, maybe because it's easier to digest a romanticized past than to deal with a messy, evolving present. A frozen shaman in feathers looks authentic. A modern shaman taking Venmo payments looks complicated. But both are real. Both belong to the same line of survival, stretching back thousands of years. So if you'd been born into that role, don't imagine yourself embalmed in amber, forever repeating the same chants under the same stars. Imagine yourself hustling, innovating, adjusting, negotiating between tradition and changes as shamans always have. Because the truth is, shamanism's power wasn't in being timeless. It was in being timely, again and again, for every community that refused to let it die. And that's the final wrong fact undone. Shamans weren't witch doctors, weren't universal, weren't hobbyists, weren't drug tourists, weren't helpless in possession, weren't all men, weren't just psychologists, weren't loners, weren't volunteers, weren't wearing costumes for flair, weren't politically neutral, weren't a religion, weren't harmless, weren't erased, and weren't relics. They were, and still are, specialists in the impossible, forever updating, forever balancing, forever the ones people turn to when the world feels out of control. And if you had been one of them, well, your drumbeat might still be echoing right now, only slightly drowned out by the sound of traffic and notifications. The figure of the shaman was always balanced precariously on a knife's edge, admired, feared, indispensable, and suspicious in equal measure. The same hands that coaxed a fever away could just as easily, people believed, summon it. The same chant that stitched a soul back into a sick child might, if turned the wrong way, unravel another person's life entirely. Communities lived with this paradox. The shaman was the one who mediated with spirits, who carried sickness out of the body, who guided the dead toward calmer places. Yet this authority came with a shadow. If a hunt failed, if a child died suddenly, if the crop soured before the harvest, suspicion had only one natural direction to point. Who else but the one who knew the hidden roads of spirits? If anyone could cure, anyone could curse. This wasn't paranoia invented later by colonizers. Even within indigenous societies, shamans were both revered and distrusted. In Siberia, people said a shaman could send invisible arrows of illness through the air. Among the Shipibo in the Amazon, a healer's song could just as easily be a weapon aimed at an enemy. In African communities, shamans sometimes competed with each other in spiritual duels, each accused of being the one responsible for a neighbor's sickness. Rivalries quickly morphed into accusations of witchcraft. The dual role was inescapable. Every time a shaman succeeded in healing, their reputation grew brighter, but the shadows around that brightness lengthened too. After all, if you could summon spirits to restore life, why wouldn't you be able to summon them to take it? Healing wasn't seen as proof of purity. It was proof of power, and power always carried suspicion. It meant that shamans lived under constant scrutiny. Fail once, and whispers began. Fail twice, and those whispers might become accusations. The village that once carried offerings to your door could turn suddenly hostile, muttering that your songs had grown too dark, your drums too heavy, your spirits too hungry. And accusations didn't only come when something went wrong. Sometimes success itself was dangerous. A shaman who grew too powerful, too influential, too indispensable risked unsettling the balance of the community. Other families, jealous or fearful, might quietly suggest that such power couldn't be entirely clean. What if the healer's great cures were only necessary because he or she was planting the sickness in the first place? That thin line between healer and sorcerer never disappeared. It was written into the role itself, part of its DNA. Communities depended on the shaman, but dependence always bred unease. The man or woman who walked nightly into the world of spirits carried with them not just healing songs, but the terrifying possibility that the songs could turn in another direction. And when suspicion hardened into accusation, the language was almost always the same: witchcraft. The word that meant both too much power and the wrong kind of power. And once that word entered the air, punishment was never far behind. Accusations didn't always come from outsiders with crosses and courts. They often began at home, within the very societies that depended on shamans most. Indigenous communities had their own vocabulary for suspicion, and their own methods for deciding when a healer had crossed over into sorcerer. In the Amazon, rival shamans frequently accused one another of launching spiritual attacks. Illness was rarely thought to happen naturally. A fever wasn't just bad luck, it was a dart, an intrusion sent by someone who knew the songs too well. Healers would gather around the sick, chanting and blowing smoke, and at the end of the ritual, produce some small object to thorn, a beetle, a piece of bone that was claimed to be the weapon of the sorcerer. The implication was obvious. Someone, somewhere, had aimed this at the patient. Rival shamans became the natural suspects. Healing ceremonies doubled as trials. In Siberia, the tension was just as sharp. Shamans could be admired as keepers of balance, yet when famine struck or the hunt failed, suspicion turned quickly. Families might accuse a rival shaman of hoarding spirits, of sending misfortune into households he disliked. Sometimes these conflicts erupted into what ethnographies called shamanic battles, not duels of swords, but duels of trance, each side drumming and chanting, each claiming to send destructive spirits against the other. Victory wasn't a body on the ground, but a death days or weeks later, attributed to the invisible strike of sorcery. Among the Dinka in East Africa and elsewhere across the continent, the line between healer and witch was even more dangerous. A person might be sought after for protection charms one week, then accused of causing unexplained deaths the next. If too many cattle perished, or too many children grew sick, blame rarely stopped at the spirits alone. Someone was directing those spirits, and the easiest target was the very person who claimed to control them. Punishments varied. In some Amazonian villages, a shaman accused of sorcery could be banished, cut off from the community he needed as much as they needed him. In harsher cases, killings occurred. In Africa, accusations of witchcraft could lead to execution by the community itself, a violent attempt to sever the dangerous tie between the suspected sorcerer and the spirits. In Siberia, punishment might be more subtle: ostracism, refusal to attend rituals, a steady erosion of authority, until the accused was powerless. Accusations didn't only destroy reputations, they reshaped communities. Every death, every famine, every failure became a chance to decide who held too much power and who needed to be brought down. The shaman lived at the center of a constant gamble, needed too much to be discarded easily, feared too much to ever be entirely safe. And this fragile balance set the stage for what happened when outsiders arrived. If communities already viewed shamans with a mix of reverence and suspicion, colonizers found it easy to tip the scale further. The word which gained new weight, and punishments became even more brutal once empires and churches entered the picture. When the colonizers came, the figure of the shaman was already precarious. Suspicion was nothing new. But now the accusations sharpened, hardened into laws, and were written in languages that carried courts, prisons, and gallows behind them. What once had been community gossip became official condemnation. European missionaries arriving in the Americas quickly declared that the rituals of local healers were the work of the devil. The drumming that once carried a healer's spirit through the night was now satanic noise. The painted masks were no longer sacred tools, but evidence of witchcraft. And the trances, once proof of contact with the other world, were reframed as possession. The body taken not by ancestors but by demons. Colonial authorities didn't need to invent suspicion. They only needed to rename it. Across northern Asia, Russian expansion brought Orthodox priests who saw every ritual drum as a direct challenge to the cross. Shamans were dragged into courts, their drums confiscated and burned in public squares. They were fined, flogged, even executed, not for crimes against their neighbors, but for crimes against the faith imposed from outside. The irony was brutal. The same societies that had once whispered about sorcery now watched as foreign judges stamped official seals onto those whispers, turning suspicion into criminal record. Spanish rule across the Andes left a particularly clear trail. Inquisitors reported the activities of native ritual specialists, noting how they spoke with mountains, rivers, and ancestral spirits. To the eyes of the church, these weren't conversations with the landscape. They were deals with Satan. Records described trials where healers were accused of keeping idols, of sacrificing animals, of calling rain through forbidden chants. Some were executed, others forced to renounce their practices, many pushed to continue in secret. And further south on the continent, Jesuit missionaries pressed even harder. Songs that once healed were outlawed. Ceremonies once held in clearings moved underground, carried out behind closed doors, disguised with the names of saints. To survive, many healers simply translated their spirits into Christian vocabulary. A forest spirit became St. Michael, a river goddess became the Virgin. The rituals stayed the same, but the labels changed. The colonial gaze saw shamans not as complex figures straddling healing and suspicion, but as obstacles to conversion, to control, to empire. Witchcraft became the blanket term, useful for criminalizing whatever could not be understood or domesticated. And once the label stuck, punishment was inevitable. Drums burned, masks confiscated, ceremonies outlawed, healers jailed or killed. Yet the role refused to vanish, because as much as the colonizers tried to erase it, the people still turned to the same figures in moments of sickness, grief, or crisis. The colonial courts could ban the words, but not the need. And in the middle of this clash, Christianity offered its sharpest weapon: demonization, not suspicion, not vague talk of sorcery, but direct condemnation. Ritual specialists were no longer simply dangerous, they were branded as evil incarnate. The colonial world didn't simply accuse shamans of dabbling in witchcraft, it rebranded them as agents of hell. Suspicion became theology, and theology demanded punishment. If the healer once stood on the thin edge between respect and fear, Christian missionaries pushed them straight over into the pit of damnation. Mission records describe it with an almost obsessive consistency. The drumbeat was the devil's language, the mask was a devil's face, the trance was nothing less than demonic possession. A ritual specialist was no longer a negotiator with spirits but a pawn of Satan himself. What had once been ambiguous half-healer, half-sorcerer was painted black with no shades left in between. In Mexico, friars wrote about native healers who spoke with demons in the hills. A man who had once been the community's raincaller was accused of making pacts with evil spirits. Women who led household ceremonies were branded witches and hauled before inquisitors. Their chants, the same ones passed down for generations, were declared proof of devil worship. To save their souls, missionaries demanded confession, destruction of ritual tools, and public renunciation. Across the Andes, reports circulated of healers who kept carved figurines, amulets, or bundles of feathers. To local eyes, these were sacred tools. To priests, they were idols and heresies. Punishment ranged from flogging to execution, and sometimes ironically conversion into Catholic lay ministers, forced to serve the very faith that condemned them. The church was pragmatic. If you couldn't erase the influence of a shaman, you tried to absorb it, chaining the same authority to a new altar. In northern territories, similar stories unfolded. When an ecstatic healer collapsed into trance, missionaries saw not ancestral spirits but demons gnawing at the body. Exorcisms were performed. Rituals were banned. Children were warned to stay away from healers as if they carried infection. Shamans became the embodiment of everything Christianity sought to stamp out: polytheism, animism, the belief that the world was crowded with unseen forces. And yet, the punishment was never just spiritual. Demonization justified confiscation of property, forced labor, even death. To label someone possessed was to strip them of protection. In the eyes of the court, they weren't simply practicing old customs. They were trafficking with evil, and evil had no rights. It's worth noticing the irony. The same figure once accused by their own neighbors of misusing power was now accused by outsiders of serving the devil. Accusations came from every direction, and no performance of healing could ever be clean enough. Suspicion within communities at least allowed for negotiation. Ritual battles, confessions, rivalries. Christian condemnation left no negotiation at all. There was only guilt. Still, people kept going to shamans in secret. If a child fell sick, if a storm lingered too long, the church might condemn, but desperation ignored doctrine. Healers carried on behind closed doors, disguising their practices, whispering the same chants with saints' names substituted for spirits. Survival depended on adaptation, but it also meant swallowing the constant risk of punishment. The word which had always been dangerous, under Christian rule, it became lethal. And in the shadows of this theology, a familiar echo emerged, one that paralleled the darkest chapters of Europe itself: the witch hunts. The flames of Europe's own witch hunts cast a long shadow, and anyone performing ecstatic rituals elsewhere in the world found themselves pulled into that light. The logic was simple and merciless. If old women in German villages could be burned for cursing cows, then men and women summoning spirits across oceans were certainly guilty of worse. The pattern repeated with uncanny precision. During the witch craze in Europe, neighbors turned on neighbors, accusing each other of causing hailstorms or stillbirths. Across the seas, healers were accused of doing the same with their drums, chants, and herbs. The language shifted little, packed with dark forces, secret meetings with unnatural beings, power that harmed instead of healed. What in one context had been framed as shamanic journeys was in another recast as witch flights through the night sky. Punishments carried the same theater: Inquisition-style trials, interrogations, confessions wrung from exhaustion. Ritual tools: drums, rattles, Bundles of feathers were paraded like cauldrons and broomsticks, trophies of supposed witchcraft. And just as in Europe, the accusation itself was often enough to destroy a life. No evidence required beyond rumor and fear. What makes the parallel sharper is that the European witch hunts had prepared the imagination for it. Missionaries didn't have to invent a category for shamans. They already had one ready-made. The figure of the witch, dangerous, seductive, and always in league with something infernal, was exported wholesale. Local healers slipped neatly into the role. This wasn't just theological paranoia, it was political utility. By branding ritual specialists as witches, colonial authorities could both terrify communities into obedience and strip power from those who still held influence outside the church. The witch became the perfect scapegoat, a category flexible enough to fit any inconvenient person, too powerful, too independent, too resistant, and the terror spread beyond courts and sermons. Villagers themselves, long accustomed to half revering, half fearing their shamans, now had new vocabulary and new punishments to draw upon. The accusation of witchcraft became sharper, deadlier. Communities that might once have settled disputes through ritual now had the precedent of pyres and gallows whispering in their ears. The great irony is that while shamans were persecuted as witches abroad, back in Europe the actual witch craze was collapsing. By the late 17th century, the fires there were cooling, skepticism rising. But overseas, in the name of conquest and conversion, the same flames were being stoked anew. A dying European obsession found new fuel in unfamiliar landscapes. What emerged was a kind of double persecution. Within their own societies, shamans could always be accused of misusing their gifts, of tipping the balance toward sorcery. With colonial pressure, those accusations now came with harsher punishments and louder echoes, backed not only by community suspicion but by the machinery of empire. The healer who once risked banishment or rivalry now risked torture, imprisonment, or death in the name of God. And when the courts decided, the stage was public. Executions, floggings, the destruction of ritual objects, all performed for spectacle, to show that the witch, whether in Europe or across the sea, had no place left to hide. But the persecution didn't stop with trials and burnings. In many places, punishments were woven into the daily life of empire. Smaller, persistent acts of humiliation that made sure shamans lived under constant threat. Suspicion alone could ruin a shaman, but when suspicion hardened into judgment, the punishments were designed not just to hurt but to humiliate. Publicity was the point. If spirits had once lifted the healer onto a pedestal, the community or the authorities made sure the fall was spectacular. Across different frontiers of empire, ritual specialists were paraded before crowds, stripped of the very objects that marked their authority. A drum smashed to pieces in front of the village wasn't just wood and hide destroyed. It was a body broken by proxy, a symbol that the shaman's flight between worlds had been clipped forever. In some regions, masks were burned in bonfires, staged deliberately to mimic witch trials, smoke rising like an inverted ritual, this time carrying not prayers but condemnation. Executions varied in method, but their logic rarely changed. To the Inquisition, the ultimate cure for demonic influence was fire. Accounts survive of native ritualists bound to stakes, condemned with the same phrases once hurled at European women accused of flying to Sabbaths. Elsewhere, flogging and exile were common, meant to both punish the accused and serve as a warning to those who might consider picking up the drum again. Colonial courts were particularly fond of forced labor, sending shamans into mines or fields, breaking their bodies in the very economic engines that conquest had built. But punishment wasn't only imposed by colonizers. Communities themselves sometimes took the lead. An accused sorcerer could be dragged into the open, beaten, even killed by neighbors who feared his or her power had turned destructive. The line between justice and vengeance blurred easily. A sudden death in the village, a failed hunt, a stillborn child, such misfortunes could trigger panic, and panic demanded a target. The person once called to heal became the person blamed for harm. What made these punishments especially cruel was their performative edge. Public whippings, staged trials, ritual desecrations, each spectacle reinforced the idea that the shaman was not merely wrong, but dangerous, contagious even. To watch a healer beaten was to be reminded that their powers were not entirely gone, but were being forcibly dismantled, piece by piece, body by body. Some punishments veered toward the grotesque, Reports from early colonial tribunals describe accused ritualists forced to confess while their sacred tools were laid out before them as proof of sorcery. Bundles of feathers, carved figurines, simple gourds, treated as infernal evidence. In Siberian towns under imperial rule, shamans were chained, paraded through markets, mocked as charlatans. Their long coats of iron plaques, once armor in the spirit world, were stripped and displayed as trophies of superstition. Defeated. And yet, despite the severity, executions rarely achieved their goal. The healer's death might terrify for a time, but illness, famine, and death didn't stop arriving. People continued to seek help, often in secret, turning to other shamans who watched the punishments with both fear and determination. Every public execution was both a warning and, ironically, an advertisement, proof that these figures still mattered enough to be targeted. But the age of fire and whips was only one stage in the long persecution. As empires modernized, punishment grew less theatrical, but no less destructive. The rhetoric of witchcraft gave way to the language of progress, and shamans were branded not as demons but as obstacles to civilization itself. By the 20th century, the bonfires and gallows had mostly given way to something colder and more bureaucratic. Shamans were no longer paraded as witches in front of village crowds. They were recast as enemies of progress, folded into the language of modernization, nationalism, and state control. The punishments didn't always look as dramatic as fire, but they could be just as devastating. The Soviet Union was ruthless in this regard. Ritual specialists were branded parasites, backward relics holding entire regions hostage to superstition. Priests were repressed, yes, but shamans were treated with a special suspicion. They were accused of sabotaging collectivization, of discouraging loyalty to the state, of keeping peasants tied to primitive thinking. Their tools, drums, costumes, masks were confiscated, sometimes displayed in museums as exhibits of obsolete culture. An object that once bridged the human and spirit worlds now sat behind glass, stripped of power and reduced to folklore. The punishments were systematic. Many shamans were imprisoned, deported to labor camps, or executed outright. Others were forced into silence, practicing only in secret, if at all. Oral traditions, songs, chants, healing practices were deliberately broken as younger generations were discouraged, even punished, for taking them up. In some areas, entire lineages of healers disappeared in a single generation. It was not only a persecution of individuals, but an attempted erasure of memory. And this logic wasn't unique to the Soviet world. In Mongolia, state campaigns targeted shamanic rituals as obstacles to socialist progress. In China, during the Cultural Revolution, ceremonial practices were outlawed as feudal superstitions. Shamans, who once presided over healing and agricultural rites, now faced public denunciation rallies. Their ritual items destroyed in orchestrated humiliations, even outside socialist regimes. Suspicion continued. Independent states, eager to present themselves as modern, often cast shamans as symbols of backwardness. National reforms declared official religions or secular systems as the only legitimate structures. Ritual healers became illegal practitioners, their ceremonies held at night, in forests, or disguised as family gatherings. The rhetoric changed, but the accusation was familiar: dangerous influence, harmful superstition, a threat to social order. No longer witches in league with demons, shamans were now witches in league with ignorance. The punishment, whether imprisonment, exile, or cultural silencing, was simply modernized witch hunting with a bureaucratic face. And yet, as before, repression could not fully extinguish the role. Communities still turned to these figures when official medicine failed, when grief demanded ritual, when state systems offered no answers. Shamans adapted, shifting their language, hiding their practices, or weaving them into permitted forms. Some even borrowed from the very ideologies that persecuted them, framing rituals as cultural heritage instead of religion, or as folk healing instead of spiritual warfare. The state could outlaw a ceremony, confiscate a drum, imprison a practitioner, but it couldn't stop a mother whispering a forbidden chant over her sick child, or a healer disguising trance as simple song. Suppression never quite succeeded. It only pushed the practice into shadow, and in the shadows, the same old dangers remained, because punishment wasn't always handed down by the state. Within communities themselves, suspicion lingered, and accusations of witchcraft didn't need a judge or a commissar to end a life. Not every accusation needed priests, inquisitors, or commissars to make it lethal. Sometimes it was the neighbors. A shaman's greatest threat could come not from colonial courts or state laws, but from the very community that relied on them. Reverence and suspicion lived side by side, and when the balance tipped, the punishment was swift, local, and often brutal. The mechanics were simple. When tragedy struck a child wasting away, a harvest blighted, a hunter lost in the forest, someone had to be blamed. Disease, drought, famine, all were rarely seen as accidents. If a healer had failed to cure, or if their powers seemed too sharp, suspicion hardened into accusation. A muttered word here, a pointed look there, and suddenly the person who once sang for the spirits was recast as the one who sent them in the first place. Punishments varied, but exile was common. An accused shaman could be driven out, left without the protection of kin or the resources of the village. Isolation itself was often a death sentence. In other cases, violence was direct. An elder suspected of witchcraft might be beaten, sometimes killed, their body left as a warning. Accounts from field ethnographies describe communities that, in moments of panic, turned on their ritual specialists with the same fervor as they once turned to them for healing. Fear often worked preemptively, a shaman growing to powerful, curing to many. Commanding too much influence might invite whispers that their power had to come at a cost. A sudden misfortune then became the perfect excuse to cut them down. Power itself was dangerous currency, and too much of it in one pair of hands upset the fragile equilibrium of village life. This wasn't confined to distant centuries. In several African contexts today, accusations of witchcraft still lead to community punishment, ritual specialists driven out, their homes burned, their lives threatened. In rural parts of South Asia, healers once respected as mediators with spirits are sometimes attacked when misfortunes multiply. The accusation is old, but the consequences remain current. The cruelty lay in the double bind. Communities needed someone to negotiate with unseen forces, to interpret dreams, to cure the inexplicable. But this dependence was threaded with paranoia. The very skills that made a shaman essential made them perpetually suspect. Too effective, and people whispered about dark bargains. Not effective enough, and they were blamed for negligence or malice. It was a role that carried reverence in one hand and a knife in the other. And punishment wasn't only physical. Reputation itself could be a death sentence. A shaman whispered about as a sorcerer might find their clients vanish, their apprentices abandon them, their lineage dissolve. In societies where knowledge was transmitted orally, silence could be just as fatal as exile. To be ignored was to be erased. The pattern is consistent across centuries. The shaman was always both guardian and threat, healer and suspect. They were indispensable, but never fully trusted. And when fear grew too sharp, communities acted sometimes with violence, sometimes with ostracism, but always with the intent of severing the dangerous link between the accused and the spirits. Yet even in the face of betrayal by their own people, shamans found ways to survive. Some disguised themselves, some reshaped their practices, some hid in plain sight. Survival demanded more than courage. It demanded camouflage. Survival demanded ingenuity. A shaman accused of witchcraft could not simply stand up and argue their innocence. Words rarely outweighed fear. The only real strategy was adaptation, bending practices until they could pass as something else, camouflaging the dangerous in the clothing of the acceptable. One of the oldest strategies was disguise. When missionaries outlawed drumming, healers learned to whisper their chants under the cover of Christian hymns. In the Andes, rituals once offered to mountain spirits were reframed as devotions to saints. The name changed, the smoke rose the same. In parts of West Africa, colonial courts banned ancestral ceremonies, but prayers were folded into church festivals, hidden in plain sight. What was once shamanic possession became, with a slight shift of language, the Holy Spirit descending. Another strategy was secrecy. Rituals moved into back rooms, forests, caves. Healing was performed at night, away from the eyes of officials and neighbors alike. Apprentices were trained quietly, often under the guise of teaching folk medicine. Tools that once announced authority, drums, rattles, iron-plated coats, were buried, dismantled, or disguised as everyday objects. A healer without their instruments was less suspicious, but the knowledge remained, stored in memory and song. Some adapted by reframing themselves entirely. Instead of presenting as spiritual mediators, They leaned into roles as herbalists, midwives, or folk doctors. Plants once classified as gateways to spirits were suddenly remedies. Chants became old songs. The trance was explained away as exhaustion, or illness, or performance. To keep the spirits alive, the language shifted. Negotiation was another tactic. In certain regions, shamans courted officials, offering their skills as allies instead of adversaries. They healed soldiers, blessed colonial ventures, or dressed their rituals in the trappings of state religion. Dangerous, yes, but occasionally successful. Aligning with power bought protection, even if it meant bending to its terms. And then there was retreat. Some simply walked away, refusing the role, living quietly in anonymity. But even that wasn't always an option. Stories across multiple regions tell of individuals who tried to abandon their calling, only to be struck by recurring illness, nightmares, or sudden misfortunes interpreted by their communities as punishment from the spirits themselves. The role, once chosen, was difficult to shed. These strategies allowed shamanism to survive where persecution was relentless. Practices shifted, adapted, disguised, sometimes split into fragments, part remembered, part erased. But even fragments were enough to keep the role alive, to hand something on to the next generation. What colonial courts and community punishments alike could never fully extinguish was the need for someone who could face the inexplicable, who could speak when ordinary voices failed. Survival, however, came with scars. Practices carried underground were marked by secrecy and suspicion. Knowledge fractured, lineages thinned, apprenticeships broken. What survived was not untouched, but reshaped by centuries of hiding. And even today, echoes of those strategies remain. Healers still slip between roles, presenting as herbalists, counselors, or performers, while carrying fragments of older knowledge. The spirits never disappeared. They simply learned new disguises. But to last was not a triumph. Accusations never vanished, only changed form. Even in the present, shamans continued to face suspicion, violence, and punishment, proof that the old word, which still lingers like a curse, the word which has outlived the empires that wielded it. Bonfires cooled, inquisitors faded into archives, commissars died at their desks. But the suspicion that once hovered over shamans has never quite dispersed. It still clings, reshaped, modernized, recycled into new contexts where fear looks for a target. In many rural communities, accusations of witchcraft remain a deadly force. Across parts of Africa, ritual specialists, sometimes respected elders, sometimes widows, sometimes children, are accused of sending illness or misfortune. Lynchings, beatings, and expulsions still occur, echoing the same logic that once stripped shamans of their drums. If someone can curse, the healer remains a suspect by definition. Elsewhere, persecution takes quieter forms. In South Asia, healers are still harassed under anti-superstition laws, their practices criminalized not for demons this time but for fraud or public harm. In northern communities across the Arctic, trance ceremonies were outlawed well into the 20th century, branded as dangerous or delusional. Even when official bans lifted, stigma lingered. People learned to speak of their healers in hushed tones, afraid of mockery or reprisal. The modern state, much like the old church, continues to frame shamans as obstacles. Some governments rebrand them as folk healers, only to regulate them into harmlessness. Others turn them into cultural mascots paraded at festivals as performers of exotic heritage, stripped of their power to accuse or to resist. A figure once feared for causing storms is now packaged for tourists, their ceremonies timed neatly between bus schedules. Survival, yes, but survival on terms that often rob the role of its original weight. And yet, despite centuries of persecution, the accusations never entirely succeed. People still turn to shamans when medicine fails, when grief overwhelms, when the inexplicable demands explanation. Shamans today may hold smartphones as well as drums, may blend prayers with pop psychology, but the underlying suspicion never fully fades. The figure is still double-edged, healer and potential sorcerer, guide and possible threat. What lingers most is the paradox. The very same qualities that once condemned shamans' visions, trances, knowledge of plants, ability to channel unseen forces are now celebrated in some circles as spirituality, condemned in others as witchcraft, and criminalized in still others as quackery. The labels change, but the unease remains constant. Even in supposedly secular societies, the echo of accusation is never far. A healer dismissed as delusional, a ceremony mocked as superstition, a practitioner branded dangerous in newspapers. It's the same old story in a new costume. What once justified burnings and whippings now justifies ridicule or regulation. The legacy of accusation is heavy. Centuries of suspicion carved into memory, entire traditions forced to hide, practices twisted into survival shapes. But that legacy also reveals resilience. For every execution, every exile, every confiscated drum, there were rituals whispered in secret, songs carried forward, healers who found ways to keep working despite it all. The punishment of shamans never fully achieved what it set out to do. They were accused, demonized, criminalized, paraded as witches, beaten by neighbors, condemned by priests, jailed by commissars, and mocked by bureaucrats. Yet they endured, and in enduring they became living proof of a paradox older than empire, that societies destroy the very figures they cannot live without. To an outsider, it looked like pure chaos. The healer collapsing, twitching, their bodies stiffening into unnatural shapes. Eyes rolled back, jaw clenched, as though gripped by some invisible hand. If anyone stumbled into such a scene without context, the word that came to mind would have been madness. Yet in countless traditions, those convulsions weren't a symptom of breakdown, they were the cure. Across the Arctic, when ritual specialists entered trance, their bodies often shook violently, as though something inside was tearing its way out. The community didn't rush to hold them down or call it illness. They waited, because this was part of the performance of healing. The sickness had to be burned out, fought off, expelled, and the healer's trembling frame was the battlefield. Every spasm was proof that spirits had entered, and that negotiations had begun. In South America, observers wrote about ritualists who staggered, moaned, and collapsed to the ground, limbs jerking as though struck by unseen arrows. The explanation was straightforward within the community. The healer was taking the sickness into their own body, letting it seize them so it could be controlled. What looked like seizure was interpreted as sacrifice. The body of the healer became the vessel where the illness was wrestled into submission. Even in early accounts from West Africa, similar scenes appear. Drummers pounding relentlessly while the healer trembled, screamed, then collapsed in exhaustion, the convulsion marking the moment the hostile force was ejected. Villagers didn't see a breakdown, they saw confirmation. The violence of the body meant the ritual had worked. A spirit that refused to leave peacefully had been forced out. The irony is sharp. Modern medicine would treat the sight as an emergency. Traditional societies treated it as reassurance. Where one sees pathology, the other sees resolution. The trembling figure was not the patient, but the Quran image of sickness made visible, so everyone could watch as it left. Convulsions also carried authority. A healer who didn't shake enough, didn't scream, didn't collapse, might be quietly judged as ineffective. The drama was part of the proof. The body had to mimic death and struggle to show that something real was at stake. A quiet ceremony risked suspicion. A violent one left no doubt. This wasn't random chaos either. The rhythm of drumming, the heat of smoke, the crowd pressing in, these weren't accidental. They pushed the healer into a state where shaking was expected, rehearsed even, an embodied script passed down through generations. Madness to one eye, choreography to another, and the patient. They didn't just watch, they often trembled too, caught up in the same rhythm, sometimes collapsing in convulsions themselves. Shared trembling meant shared healing. What looked like mass hysteria in the eyes of a foreign observer was, within the community, the sickness dispersing across bodies until it dissolved. Convulsions as cure remind us how fragile the line is between breakdown and ritual. What seems like madness depends entirely on who's watching. For those inside the circle, every twitch, every collapse, was a sign that spirits had listened, that the invisible had been dragged into sight. And once the healer rose again, drenched in sweat, body trembling from exhaustion, the next stage could begin the violent extractions, where the sickness that had shaken the body was pulled out in forms far stranger than spasms. After the convulsions came the proof. Healing didn't stop with a trembling body. It had to be made visible, tangible, something the community could see with their own eyes. And so began the violent extractions. In countless traditions, sickness was imagined not as an invisible germ, but as a physical intruder lodged inside the body. To heal meant pulling it out. Shamans and ritual specialists staged this with theatrical precision. They leaned over the patient, sucked noisily at the skin, and spat out an object: a thorn, a shard of bone, a beetle, a clot of blood, declaring it to be the source of the illness. To an observer unfamiliar with the script, it looked like sleight of hand, trickery dressed up as madness. To the community, it was the climax of the cure. Reports from the Amazon describe healers extracting long thorns from the flesh of feverish patients, holding them aloft as the crowd gasped. In the Arctic, ritualists spat out fragments of bone or hair, claiming they had pulled them from the patient's lungs or stomach. Across the plains of North America, ritual sucking was common, followed by the dramatic display of a small stone or insect, shaken in the healer's palm for everyone to see. This wasn't stage magic for amusement. It was proof that the illness had been located and expelled. The patient's suffering now had a form, a body of its own, and the healer had forced it out. Without this display, the ceremony was incomplete. Healing wasn't private. It was communal. Everyone had to witness the sickness leaving. The methods were deliberately visceral. Loud sucking noises, violent spitting, sometimes even gagging. Healers dramatized the struggle as though dragging out the sickness through their own throats. Theatrical, yes, but also deeply persuasive. A patient who saw their fever turned into a thorn believed themselves cured, and belief itself often completed what the ritual began. There's an unsettling elegance in how universal this practice was. From South America to Siberia, the idea of pulling illness out with the mouth recurs with remarkable consistency. Anthropologists debate whether it was symbolic theater or psychosomatic medicine, but for those inside the ritual, no such distinction mattered. The healer's mouth became the tool, the boundary where invisible harm crossed back into the visible world. Of course, not every extraction was tidy. Sometimes healers claimed the sickness resisted, hiding deeper inside the body. The ritual could grow violent, with shaking, pressing, even striking the patient to loosen the intruder. Outsiders saw brutality. Communities saw determination. Pain was evidence that the healer was fighting something real. And then came the disposal. The extracted object couldn't simply be left lying around. It carried danger, a fragment of hostile force. Healers buried it, burned it, or cast it into rivers, sealing the cure with destruction. A thorn spat out onto the floor wasn't harmless. It was still dangerous until ritually neutralized. The irony is impossible to miss. What looked like trickery to a missionary or explorer producing a beetle from a feverish child's chest was the very thing that gave the ritual its power. The spectacle wasn't an illusion meant to deceive. It was the visible proof that made healing real. And once the object was destroyed, attention turned to the sounds, the noises that could drive away whatever fragments lingered. The cure wasn't only in hands and mouths. It was in the voice, in chaotic singing and screams that seemed unhinged, but were believed to terrify sickness into leaving for good. Once the sickness had been spat out in some thorn or stone, the healer often wasn't finished. Illness wasn't seen as a simple intruder. It had allies, animal forms, lurking spirits. To fight them, the healer didn't stay human. They turned into something else. Animal mimicry was everywhere in healing rituals. A man might hiss like a snake, crawl on all fours, and snap his teeth as though biting the air. A woman might growl low in her throat, rising into shrieks that echoed like birds of prey. Outsiders described these scenes with words like madness, frenzy, or degradation. To the community, this was the language of spirits. The healer wasn't losing their mind, they were speaking in tongues that sickness understood. Among Inuit accounts, ritual specialists were said to roar like bears when calling their spirit helpers, shaking their heads until hair whipped their faces. In the lowlands of South America, healers imitated jaguars, pacing, snarling, even leaping suddenly at shadows, as though swiping at invisible predators. Across the grasslands of Africa, healers hissed, clucked, and bleated, not as parody, but as proof that animal spirits were entering their bodies to fight the unseen. It's easy to imagine the bewilderment of early missionaries walking in on such a scene. A respected elder on the floor, frothing and barking like a dog, while villagers watched intently, nodding with approval. Madness, they thought. Yet within the cultural logic of the ritual, the transformation was the cure. The healer's body became the battlefield. The their voice the weapon. To roar was to summon strength, to hiss was to drive out venom, or was to call protective spirits swooping in like birds. The mimicry wasn't random either. Every sound had a lineage, taught by apprenticeships, carried in songs, remembered through generations. It was, yes, but it was performance with rules. A bear's roar meant strength, a serpent's hiss meant precision, a bird's cry meant vision. The healer shifted between forms depending on the illness at hand. To cure fever, one set of animal voices, to cure madness another, and the body joined in. Crawling, leaping, swaying movements that seemed chaotic to foreign eyes but carried deep symbolism. A man crawling on all fours might be enacting the hunt, chasing the spirit of sickness until it fled. A woman swaying like a bird in flight might be traveling to the world beyond, returning with lost vitality. The healer's body was theater, but not for entertainment, for proof, for reassurance, for the conviction that healing was happening right there, before everyone's eyes. There's a quiet brilliance in this. Illness is invisible. Its symptoms are visible, but its cause is not. The healer made the invisible visible by becoming it. To hiss, to roar, to crawl was to give form to the sickness so that the community could see it fought and defeated. Madness to one perspective, medicine to another. And when the mimicry grew too wild, too loud, too overwhelming, it slipped into pure noise chants, screams, chaotic soundscapes that filled the air. The healer's voice, breaking into madness itself, became a weapon, a wall of sound meant to terrify whatever still lingered. Sometimes the cure demanded blood, not the patient's, but the healer's. Outsiders watching these ceremonies often wrote about them with disgust. Ritual specialists cutting their own arms with sharp flints, piercing cheeks with bone needles, or pressing burning coals against their skin. To foreign eyes, it looked like lunacy, the kind of senseless self-destruction that belonged in an asylum. But within the ritual, this pain was not madness, it was medicine. The logic was consistent. Illness had to be drawn out, and pain was the magnet. By cutting into their own flesh, healers offered themselves as the bait, inviting sickness to move from the patient into their body. Blood, dripping into bowls or onto the earth, wasn't proof of injury. It was proof that the illness had been captured, lured into the open. In some healing rites, the shaman pressed sharp thorns into their chest or arms until they bled, then licked the wounds while chanting. The act looked deranged, grotesque even, but to the gathered onlookers, it showed commitment. The healer wasn't standing apart from suffering, they were sharing it, embodying it, carrying it. Every cut was a contract. The sickness leaves the patient and enters me. Other accounts describe healers deliberately burning themselves with resin torches, holding flames against their skin until blisters rose. The crowd didn't gasp in horror, they murmured in awe. Fire purified, burned away disease, consumed the invisible. Tooth, scar oneself in front of everyone, was to guarantee that purification had taken place. Even more dramatic were the piercings, bones pushed through cheeks or lips, ropes threaded through skin, sometimes even dangling weights. To a missionary's notebook, this was the devil's circus. To the community, it was sacrifice, endurance, and proof that the healer had the strength to fight what ordinary flesh could not. And this wasn't simply about spectacle. The pain itself altered the healer's state, tipping them deeper into trance, cracking the mind open through suffering. Convulsions might carry them into possession, mimicry might give them the spirit's voices, but pain tore down the body's defenses. Through wounds, the unseen could pass more freely. The healer's scarred skin became a doorway. The strange thing is how often patients reported relief. Watching someone cut themselves for your sake, bleed for your sickness, offered a profound reassurance. The healer's suffering became the cure's proof. If they endured such torment and still stood afterward, how could the illness possibly resist? It was, in its way, a psychological operation. The dramatization of sacrifice replaced despair with belief, and belief itself could tip the body toward recovery. But to the eye untrained in ritual logic, all that remained was the horror. A man slicing into his arms, a woman holding fire against her skin until smoke rose. Madness, clearly, unless you were the one being healed. And when the wounds had been cut, and the sickness supposedly bled out, the healer turned to another tool, entirely not blood, but sound. The body gave way to the voice. Two chaotic singing and screams, so piercing they seemed less like music than a storm meant to drive spirits out. After the cuts and burns came the noise, Healing wasn't always quiet prayer or solemn chants. It could erupt into what sounded like pure frenzy. Healers burst into shrieks, rattling their voices until they cracked, their throats raw with dissonant howls. Outsiders wrote about this with the tone of someone describing a madhouse choir. Loud, uncoordinated, overwhelming. Yet to those inside the circle, this chaos wasn't meaningless racket. It was the sound of war. Sickness wasn't seen as passive. It was alive, stubborn, and had to be driven out. And what better weapon than noise? Low chants rattled into the chest. Shrill screams pierced the air like spears. Long wails twisted into the night until they sounded less human than elemental. Some ceremonies lasted hours, voices rising and falling in waves that battered the invisible enemy. There are accounts of healers planting themselves beside the patient and unleashing a torrent of sound directly into the ears, half song, half scream, until the body shook with vibration. The point wasn't melody. It was force. A scream so loud it seemed to strip the skin was thought to scare away whatever spirit clung to the sick. And if the healer's voice cracked or faltered, all the better. The roughness itself was proof of the struggle. To an observer from outside, it was unbearable. One missionary described a howling cacophony that seemed to summon madness itself. But within the community, every pitch had a purpose. The broken tones mirrored the chaos of sickness, mimicked it, mocked it, and in doing so, pushed it out. Healing required not harmony, but disruption. The sound didn't belong only to the healer. Often the whole group joined in, clapping, chanting, stamping feet, creating a wall of noise that swallowed the night. Collective screaming blurred the line between patient, healer, and audience. Everyone became part of the cure, their voices weaving into a storm that no illness could withstand. Outsiders called it hysteria. Insiders called it medicine. What's striking is how similar patterns appear in so many places. Loud, harsh sounds as weapons against disease. Screams not as signs of collapse, but as proof that spirits had entered and were being expelled. The healer's voice became the spear, the shield, the battlefield itself. And sometimes the noise slipped into absurdity. Healers breaking into strange, stuttering syllables, nonsense words, even laughter that tilted into hysteria. From outside, it looked like gibberish. From inside, it was spirit language. Words not meant to be understood by humans, but recognized by the unseen. Madness to one ear, negotiation to another. The patient, lying at the center of this maelstrom, often shook, cried, or even screamed along. Their own voice joined the healers, the sickness expelled, not only from the body but from the throat. To purge illness, one had to make it audible, force it out with noise. And when the storm of voices finally ebbed, silence itself carried weight. The hush that followed was proof that the enemy had gone, leaving the air suddenly light, emptied. Healing wasn't gentle. It was a violent sound followed by peace. But sound wasn't the only medium. Sometimes the healer didn't just scream at the illness, they fought it with the body, wrestling the patient, grappling on the floor, shaking them as though dragging an intruder out with sheer force. If screaming wasn't enough, sometimes the cure looked more like a brawl. Healers didn't simply sing at sickness. They grabbed hold of Itor. Rather, they grabbed hold of the patient, wrestling them as though the illness were hiding deep in their muscles and had to be shaken loose. To an onlooker, it was violence masquerading as treatment. To the community, it was battle, staged in flesh and sweat. Accounts tell of healers straddling patients, pressing them into the ground, shaking their limbs until joints cracked. Others describe dragging the sick across dirt floors, pounding their backs, or yanking them upright, only to slam them down again. To outsiders, the scene looked deranged, an exhausted, feverish body being manhandled by someone in trance. Yet within the ritual logic, this wasn't cruelty. The healer wasn't attacking the patient, they were attacking the thing inside. The fight was symbolic and literal all at once. If sickness was imagined as an intruder clinging to the body, then grappling became the means of tearing it away. A cough wasn't just infection, it was a grip. A shiver wasn't just weakness, it was resistance. The healer's role was to shake, strike, and drag until the invader finally let go. There are descriptions of ceremonies where both healer and patient ended in collapse, sprawled together in the dirt, drenched in sweat, breathing ragged. The community watching didn't rush in to separate them. They waited, knowing this exhaustion was the sign that the battle had reached its climax. Healing wasn't gentle, it demanded spectacle, and nothing was more convincing than seeing sickness thrown to the ground. Sometimes the patient fought back, flailing, screaming, pushing away. To foreign observers, this looked like resistance, even abuse, but to the participants, it was expected. The illness itself was putting up a fight, using the patient's body as its last weapon. If the patient thrashed, it only proved the ritual was working, that the intruder was being flushed out. In some places, wrestling was dramatized further with tools, ropes thrown around patients, not to restrain but to lasso the spirit. The healer dragged the body as though hauling out the sickness physically. Other times, the patient was shaken upside down, head lowered, to pour the illness out. Methods varied, but the logic was steady. The cure was violent because the illness was stubborn. And yet, patients often reported relief afterward. Bruised, perhaps, but lighter, freer. The belief that the sickness had been physically torn away worked as powerfully as any herb or chant. What looked like madness to strangers was, within the ritual, theater with real consequences. It's tempting to dismiss it as cruelty, but the truth is more unsettling. The violence wasn't random. It was ritualized, structured, rehearsed across generations. Madness had rules. Every push, every pull, every blow had meaning. And once the fight ended and the bodies lay still, the ceremony often shifted. Silence fell. The patient, half conscious, might be left motionless, as though dead, while the healer declared the sickness gone. And sometimes, in a final act of proof, the healer themselves collapsed, mimicking death entirely, only to be revived in front of the community. There were moments when healing meant more than fighting, or bleeding it meant dying, or at least appearing to. Ritual specialists in many places collapsed suddenly, bodies limp, breathing slowed to nothing, eyes rolled back into white. Outsiders described these scenes with horror, the healer lying as if struck dead, surrounded by chanting, while the community waited. But this wasn't tragedy, it was theater, and it was cure. Death and rebirth carried enormous symbolic weight. Illness itself was often framed as a kind of death in miniature, the body stolen, weakened, half gone to the other side. To heal, one had to enact the reversal. And so the healer performed the collapse, slipping into stillness as though joining the patient in death. The crowd watched with dread and expectation. If the healer could come back, so could the sick. Some accounts describe healers lying motionless for hours, limbs stiff, skin pale, no sound escaping their throat. The silence was deliberate, a contrast to the chaos of earlier stages, the convulsions, the screams, the wrestling. Silence confirmed the depth of the journey. The healer had gone far into the spirit world, and the body left behind was nothing but a husk. Then came the revival. Assistants shook the limp frame, splashed water, blew smoke, called the healer's name, slowly, deliberately. The body twitched, gasped, shuddered back into life. To the community, this was not simply revival. It was proof. If the healer could die and return, they could bring the patient back to you. Death had been rehearsed, mocked, reversed. Sometimes the drama was shared. The patient, too, collapsed into stillness, carried along by exhaustion or trance. Villagers might cover them with cloth, wail as though mourning, then rejoice when they stirred again. The ritual mirrored a funeral, only inverted. What looked like madness a village enacting death for the living was medicine. Grief was staged to create its opposite. There's an eerie irony in how universal this motif is. From the forests to the plains, from deserts to islands, healers collapsed, died, and were resurrected. The performance carried deep psychological force. To see death defied was to believe life could return, and belief, in turn, shifted bodies, calmed fevers, lifted despair. Foreigners called it deception, hysteria, and charlatanry, but the act wasn't aimed at skeptics. It was aimed at the community, at the patient, at the spirits themselves. A healer who could feign death convincingly wasn't a fraud. They were a master of ritual. They had shown that their body could be a stage where the great drama of mortality played out and was conquered. And once the bodies rose again, healer and patient alike, the tension released into movement, often into rhythm. The stillness of death gave way to frenzied dancing, whole communities stamping and swaying until collapse. What looked like hysteria to outsiders was the logical next step. Resurrection demanded celebration, and healing demanded a collective storm. After the healer had collapsed into death and returned again, stillness rarely lasted. What followed was movement, wild, exhausting, unrelenting. Whole communities erupted into rhythm, stamping feet, shaking bodies, swaying until sweat poured and exhaustion dragged them to the ground. From the outside, the scene looked like mass hysteria, the kind of contagious madness fit for medical reports and colonial diaries. But inside the circle, it was healing, not just for one, but for all. The logic was simple. Illness wasn't always individual. It clung to families, seeped into villages, infected fields of crops. To purge it, the entire group had to move. And so they danced. Not graceful steps or rehearsed choreography, but repetitive stamping, circling, collapsing and rising again. The rhythm of drums, rattles, clapping hands drove the frenzy until it blurred the boundary between body and spirit. Observers wrote about villages where everyone from the elderly to children barely able to walk joined the trance dance, staggering together through the night. Some collapsed in piles, breathing heavily, twitching as though spirits tugged their limbs. Others screamed while spinning, hair whipping across faces, voices breaking into laughter or sobs. To a missionary's pen, it was delirium. To those within, it was the spirit of sickness being chased out in waves, expelled with every stomp. What gave these dances their strange power was the collective nature. A single convulsion might be dismissed as madness, but a whole community convulsing together became order disguised as chaos. The illness could not resist when the healthy joined the sick, when bodies merged into one rhythm of rejection. Every collapse to the ground echoed the healer's feigned death. Every rise mirrored resurrection. The group became its own medicine, and there was endurance in it. Some accounts describe ceremonies that lasted until dawn, dancers moving until they dropped, then dragged upright again by neighbors, pushed back into the rhythm. Collapse wasn't failure, it was proof. The body giving out meant the ritual had worked its way through. When one person fell, another carried the movement, keeping the rhythm alive. Madness in the eyes of strangers, but to those inside, it was the stubborn persistence of life itself. The irony is that, stripped of ritual, the mechanics look familiar. Rhythmic movement, exhaustion, communal catharsis. It resembles what modern societies call therapy, or festival, or rave. The difference is that here, the frenzy wasn't distraction. It was cure. The sweat, the collapse, the wild shaking bodies were medicine made visible, enacted in dirt courtyards and torchlit clearings. By the end, silence fell heavy. Bodies lay sprawled, chests heaving, the dust of the ground clinging to damp skin. Children slept where they had collapsed. Elders leaned against posts, exhausted. And in that silence, relief. The sickness had been chased away, replaced by stillness and sleep. Madness had looked like salvation, but frenzy wasn't the only strange mask of healing. Sometimes the cure didn't come from exhaustion or noise, but from absurdity itself. Rituals where healers acted like fools, clowns, even tricksters. Outrageous gestures, obscene jokes, laughter that seemed insane but carried medicine of its own. Not every cure came from screaming, convulsing, or wrestling with shadows. Sometimes healing looked ridiculous. The ritual specialist who had just bled for the spirits might suddenly drop into a crouch, cross their eyes, and begin babbling nonsense. Others leaped about naked, shouting obscenities, or fell into slapstick tumbles, rolling in the dust like drunks. Outsiders described it as humiliation, madness, or mockery. Yet within the community, laughter itself was medicine. Trickster healing was as old as any bloodletting. The logic was simple but profound. Despair weakens, laughter restores. Illness could linger not just in the body but in the spirit of the sick and the heaviness of those around them. To break that weight, the healer became absurd. By ridiculing themselves, they ridiculed the illness. By shattering solemnity, they shattered despair. Reports tell of healers deliberately mangling ritual songs, singing them off-key until the entire group laughed. Others pulled exaggerated faces, spat water onto the ground, or simulated grotesque acts that left crowds gasping in laughter. Outsiders recoiled, unable to grasp why sacred rituals slipped into what looked like vulgar theater. But the boundary wasn't a contradiction. It was the cure. The absurd reminded the community that the illness had no ultimate power, that even spirits could be mocked. In some Arctic ceremonies, healers deliberately acted foolish, stumbling or pretending to fall asleep mid-ritual, only to jolt awake in exaggerated fashion. In Central Asian accounts, the healer would shout jokes or insults at the spirits, taunting them into leaving. In certain desert rites, obscenity itself was weaponized. The healer cracked jokes, so obscene they shocked the crowd into laughter. breaking fear's grip. It seems contradictory, screaming one moment, clowning the next, but paradox was the point. Illness thrived on predictability, on solemn weight. Healing needed rupture. A scream tore the air, a laugh tore despair. The patient, caught between tears and laughter, had no choice but to let go. Foreign observers labeled this madness, degradation of religion, even devilry. They missed the deeper irony. Inverting order was itself sacred. Chaos was part of balance. In many traditions, the fool and the Holy One weren't opposites. They were masks of the same figure. The healer embodied both, divine conduit and clown, dignified vessel and buffoon. By collapsing those roles together, they embodied the strangeness of life itself, where healing never looked neat, never sounded orderly, and laughter had a social function too. When whole communities joined in, the act wasn't just for the patient. It lightened the entire group, lifting fear, restoring cohesion. Illness divided, laughter gathered. The buffoonery was serious work, restoring what grief had broken. At the close of such ceremonies, the healer might end with one last absurd gesture, falling flat on their face, spluttering nonsense, or mimicking the illness itself in exaggerated form before banishing it. The community roared, half in humor, half in relief. The ritual ended, not in silence, but in laughter echoing through the night. Madness, yes, but a madness sharpened into medicine. Convulsions, screams, wounds, dances, and jokes, each an act that from the outside looked deranged, from the inside meant healing. Rituals turned chaos into order, violence into cure, laughter into survival. What appeared insane was, in truth, a reminder of something deeper. The body and spirit could be broken in many ways, and sometimes the cure had to be stranger than the sickness itself.